Recently, I've received numerous comments from people asking me to do a video about Paul Joseph Watson. Where do you stand with Paul Joseph Watson? Perhaps on his neck? Congratulations, Bulletproof Blouse, you've just won the internet. Paul Joseph Watson made a video titled Why Capitalism is Great. Could you please do a response to it? It's a video full of cancer and his fans are Alex Jones nuts. Or just Paul Joseph Watson's channel in general. That slimy little fuck is in need of a good smackdown. So I went over to his channel and was unsurprised to find yet another condescending, self-important white guy moaning about feminism on the internet, because apparently that hasn't been done enough already. Naturally, I started rubbing my hands with delight, because his channel's such a goldmine of shit videos that you could select one entirely at random out of a hat and still find a million things to pick apart. If you have any cherished personal belongings in your proximity, I suggest you put them out of harm's way, because today, Paul's going to tell us why capitalism is great.
This past weekend, hundreds of thousands of people utilised one of capitalism's greatest achievements, the smartphone.
Yep, that's 7 seconds in and you've already made an error. Well done. Later in the video you describe capitalism as the unregulated free market and assert that state intervention in the market in order to advance the interests of private corporations is something called corporatism, which you consider to be completely different from capitalism. I'll explain later why this distinction you make is completely meaningless in the real world, but for the time being, suffice it to say that the smartphone was developed as a result of just such state intervention. Not only did Apple receive $500,000 as a government grant in its early stages, but also the internet, GPS, touchscreen displays and even voice activation systems were developed through the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, a government-funded body which develops technology for use by the military. By your own logic, then, the smartphone would therefore be an example of corporatism, not the glorious free market that you're trying to defend here. So, bit of a shaky start, but never mind, let's move on.
To send the hashtag #ResistCapitalism trending worldwide on Twitter. Here's a sample of their idiocy.
The bourgeois and their racist, sexist capitalism must be purged. Cis white males will be the first against the wall. #ResistCapitalism.
A bit hyperbolic admittedly, but it's a bit careless not to ask why these people are angry in the first place. If I were a black trans woman and my experience of cis white men largely consisted of being patronised to by people like you, I would be angry as well.
We have enough tech innovation and resources for everyone globally to work 4 hours a week and pursue life, art, hobbies. #ResistCapitalism. Your employer is stealing from you every minute you're on the job. #ResistCapitalism.
And you make no effort whatsoever to refute either of these statements.
Dear Mom's basement dwelling communists, if you actually did resist capitalism with any degree of success, the following would not exist. Twitter, the iPhone you're tweeting #ResistCapitalism from, the internet.
Again, these were developed through government-funded research, and therefore by your standards should be considered a product of corporatism, not capitalism. Also, the implication you're making here seems to be that if you use products from the system we live under, then you have no right to criticise such a system. There's this undertone of, oh, you're a socialist, but you buy stuff. What's that all about? How does that work? Lol. This kind of lazy thinking is on a level with that of Tory MP and writer of garbage chicklet Louise Mensch.
They tweet about it regularly on their iPhones, perhaps in between getting cafe lattes and housing themselves in some very fancy tents. But they are against capitalism, except for the lattes.
So if they buy coffee, their opinions are worthless.
We can't escape the fact that right now we live in a capitalist system. It surrounds us. All of the things that we need to live have a price tag on them, and therefore we must participate in the capitalist system on some level in order to survive. Saying that people are wrong to criticise capitalism when they use products from capitalism ignores the fact that they don't really have a meaningful choice. It's like saying to a serf, how can you be against feudalism if you still eat potatoes?
Here's the truth about capitalism. It's the single greatest force in history to alleviate suffering, bring billions of people out of poverty, and create healthier, more prosperous societies and higher living standards for all.
Let's ignore the fact that the 67 richest people in the world have the same amount of wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people in the world. Let's ignore the fact that in countries where they can get away with it, multinational corporations regularly assassinate trade union leaders who try to organise for better wages.
Socialists don't even know what capitalism is. They confuse capitalism with corporatism.
Yep, I knew this was coming. Just every fucking time. Just get on with it.
Corporatism is the opposite of free market capitalism because it depends on collusion between well-connected large corporations and the state. Capitalism is about the free exchange of goods and services.
This is an entirely reductionist definition of capitalism. It's not just any system with a market, and contrary to what the shit spewers of the Austrian school might have you believe, it's definitely not anything that human beings do voluntarily. Capitalism has three components: private ownership of the means of production, exchange of goods and services for profit in a market economy, and wage labour. Historically, private property and wage labour have always existed alongside a state, because private owners need a state to protect their wealth from the majority. The distinction made by right-wing libertarians between corporatism and capitalism is entirely meaningless in the real world, because historically, capitalists have always needed a state to protect their economic interests, ranging from the enclosures when capitalism first came about, to vagabond laws, to the role of the police in society today. To call this corporatism and act as though it's entirely separate from capitalism is to simply ignore how capitalism developed historically.
A competitive market creates quality because businesses fail if they don't please the consumer. Corporatism is about creating artificial monopolies that drive up prices and punish the consumer. Capitalism isn't the problem. Corporatism is the problem.
This argument makes your video self-contradictory in two ways. First of all, you assert that free market capitalism is responsible for all of the brilliant things we have. But then you say, we don't have free market capitalism, we have corporatism, and that's the problem. Secondly, your earlier implication that we are wrong to criticise a system if we use products from said system would imply that you are wrong here to criticise corporatism, given that you are using products from what you call corporatism. So we're just a quarter of the way through the video, and already there are multiple arguments happening here which are both factually incorrect and internally inconsistent with one another. I can only assume there's more incoherent kettle logic to come.
Socialism is toxic to a healthy society because it punishes success and rewards failure. As Winston Churchill said, socialism is the equal sharing of miseries.
I love the fact that you decry collusion between big business and the state, and then just 30 seconds later start quoting Thatcher and Churchill with no apparent sense of irony.
Socialism extorts money from the successful and gives it to the lazy.
Okay, so first of all, you haven't given the viewers any information about this person's economic or medical circumstances. And why should you? You have no authority to talk about either of these things. Are we meant to assume that they must just be lazy just because they're fat? For all we know, they might be reacting in such an excited manner out of relief because they don't have any other means of economic support. For all we know, they might have a medical condition which means they have to stay at home. If we don't know these things, then it's wrong for us to simply make our assumptions without knowing the full story. The irony here is that you're just parroting scrounger narratives about the so-called deserving and undeserving poor that are used to demonise people on welfare, a simple divide and rule strategy promoted by the corporate state through the mainstream capitalist media. You dress it up as though you're being contrarian and going against the grain, but these narratives come straight out of the ruling Tory party.
I mean, just look, most of them have got shoes. The sense of entitlement is amazing. They use oxygen without even paying for it. They just inhale it and convert it into carbon dioxide, selfishly leaving less for the taxpayer. They've even got sticks and bits of old fan. I haven't got sticks and bits of old fan, why should they?
Secondly, if you bothered to actually read any classical socialist authors, e.g. Marx, Engels, Bakunin, Proudhon, etc., you would know that socialism has nothing to do with the welfare state. It's about workers' control over the means of production. The welfare state is not an example of socialism. It's simply a social democratic policy which exists within a capitalist system.
Socialism disincentivizes success, meaning that businesses which make profit and create jobs, and people that actually produce and contribute to society, flee from countries that embrace socialism to those that embrace capitalism.
So apparently having a 75% tax rate means that France has embraced socialism. That's fucking hilarious. Given that the top rate of income tax during Churchill's first term in office was over 90%, it had to be in order to fund the war effort, by your own logic, Churchill would be embracing socialism. Your own reference to Churchill would suggest that socialism is not about taxation and spending, and yet you're basing all of your arguments against socialism on the idea that socialism is about taxation and spending. But it's not. It's about workers' control over the means of production. That's something that you would be aware of had you actually bothered to read a single socialist author before making such a horrendously incoherent and poorly researched video.
We'd all be a lot wealthier and happier if it wasn't for governments, socialists and corporatists trying to curtail free market capitalism.
In Bad Samaritans, development economist Ha-Joon Chang uses multiple historical examples to lay waste to the assertion that the Western world owes its wealth to free market policies. It's a myth. If you bothered to read up properly on the subject, instead of trotting out whatever crap you hear coming out of the Cato Institute, you would know this.
Look at the capitalist miracle in China.
You know, the term market fundamentalist exists because you people really do talk like proselytizing hyper-religious fanatics. Oh, it's a capitalist miracle once again. Praise the market. Ding 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 ding.
In the last 3 decades, China has lifted more people out of extreme poverty than the rest of the world combined. 680 million people have escaped poverty in China thanks to capitalism. And it's a similar situation in India.
First of all, you don't give any evidence as to why you believe free market policies specifically are responsible for this. Secondly, it's not as if these countries don't have their problems. Conditions for workers in China, especially migrant workers, are awful. After frequent suicide attempts by workers in one of their factories in China in 2010, Foxconn has since had nets installed beneath the windows in order to catch workers in case they try to throw themselves from the factory windows. People are made to work more than 60 hours a week in horrendous conditions for a tuppence. By all means, everything is not fine and dandy. Finally, given the authoritarian nature of the political system in China, this would easily qualify as an example of corporatism by your own standards, and thus wouldn't be supportive of your argument.
Look at the standard of living in countries that reject capitalism. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet its socialist government struggles to even provide its people with milk, flour and toilet paper.
But this is a society in which the functions of capital have not been abolished. They've simply been undertaken by the state instead. Given the lack of workers' control over the means of production, the most basic criteria for socialism, it's inaccurate to describe Venezuela as socialist.
But over in capitalist Chile, which has virtually no natural resources, its citizens enjoy the 3rd highest living standards in all of America.
Let's just conveniently gloss over the fact that establishing neoliberal capitalism in Chile required the military overthrow of a democratically elected government in 1973 and the installation of a dictatorship under Pinochet, which imprisoned and tortured tens of thousands of political dissidents and forced 200,000 people into exile. But of course, if I bring this up as a critique of capitalism, you'll just flip-flop now and say that Chile is corporatist, not capitalist. It's corporatist when you want to criticise it, and capitalist when you want to praise it.
Compare places like Hong Kong, which has no significant natural resources, to Cuba, which has an abundance of them. Before Castro's communism, capitalist Cuba had a per capita income higher than Spain and Portugal.
It also had press censorship, suppression of basic civil liberties, a secret police force, the drugs, gambling and prostitution industry in Havana was controlled by the American mafia, and the American government provided Batista with weapons assistance as he killed thousands of dissidents and systematically profited from the exploitation of Cuba's commercial interests. But again, if I bring this up as a critique of capitalism, you'll just flip-flop and say that Batista's Cuba was corporatist, not capitalist. Again, it's corporatist when you want to criticise it, and capitalist when you want to praise it.
After Castro's communism, Cuba became a rundown economic failure stuck in a 1950s time warp.
Given that Cuba lacks workers' control over the means of production, and given that the functions of capital have not been abolished in Cuba, they've simply been undertaken by the state instead, it's fundamentally inaccurate to describe Cuba as being communist. State capitalist would be a much more accurate term. If you knew anything about socialism or communism, you would know that Cuba is not socialist or communist in any accurate sense of the term.
Like Cuba, Hong Kong was under an embargo from its nearest superpower, China. Back then it was one giant shantytown. But after embracing capitalism, Hong Kong now routinely tops lists for prosperity and quality of life.
Hong Kong also has the highest level of income inequality in the developed world. In a Hong Kong-owned electronics factory in Dongguan, 16-year-old girls are made to work 13-hour shifts every single day for the equivalent of about $50 a month, while living in poorly maintained, smelly dormitories. The company controls almost every aspect of their lives. Fun, fun, fun.
Compare Stalinist North Korea with capitalist South Korea. Same people, same location in the world, same natural resources. South Korea has produced Samsung, Hyundai and LG. North Korea has produced record starvation, concentration camps for political dissidents, and a line of hereditary dictators.
Like Cuba, North Korea is another example of a society in which the functions of capital have not been abolished but instead undertaken by the state. As such, it's not communist in any real sense of the term. As for South Korea, in 23 Things They Didn't Tell You About Capitalism, Ha Jun-chang draws attention to the fact that South Korea's economic growth was not brought about as a result of free market policies, but rather state-funded public investment programs. So if we're going by your definitions, not that they make sense, South Korea's growth would be a result of corporatism and not capitalism, which would refute your own argument.
Anti-capitalists point to Sweden as an example of a country that embraced socialism and prospered.
These people are liberals, Paul. They're not anti-capitalists, they're liberals. Jesus, it just shows that you have absolutely no idea what anti-capitalists actually believe. Given that this point is moot, we can simply fast forward through it. Christ, you're an idiot.
People who support socialism are also far greedier than those who support capitalism. Studies show that poorer conservatives are more generous than wealthier liberals when it comes to giving to charity.
But there's more than one variable at play here. Not only are there differing political viewpoints, but there are also differing degrees of wealth. To simply assert that it must be their conservatism that's responsible for their generosity and not their being poor is transparently deceptive. In rudimentary high school level science, it's taught that if you want to investigate a relationship between one variable and an outcome, you have to make sure that all of the other variables are kept the same. Otherwise, it's not scientific.
Look, capitalism is by no means perfect.
Oh, really? Oh, I was so convinced by the weight of your arguments that I thought it was.
There's still poverty in capitalist countries because we don't live in a utopia. We still live in a meritocracy where intelligence and hard work is rewarded with wealth.
So if you happen to be rich, it must be because you worked hard, and if you happen to be poor, it must be because you're lazy. Despite saying that capitalism is by no means perfect, you seem to think that whatever amount of wealth someone possesses in a capitalist system must be a direct reflection of how much they have contributed to society. Naturally, the rich must be fucking saints, and the poor must be scum. Funny how that works, isn't it? Also, this argument that we live in a meritocracy completely disregards the cycle of poverty and the fact that if you grow up in a poor background, you'll tend to stay poor, and people from rich backgrounds tend to stay rich.
But even for those needy people who fall behind, capitalism provides a safety net via the welfare state.
Just a few minutes ago, you were giving it all that about how, the welfare state is socialism, and it promotes laziness and all that. And now you're saying, capitalism's not perfect, but hey, we've got the welfare state thanks to capitalism. Jesus, what is wrong with you?
America's poverty line for a family of 4 is $63 a day. In the poorest countries, which haven't embraced capitalism, it's $1.25 a day. So by resisting capitalism, you're actually promoting an economic system that guarantees destitution and misery for the most amount of people.
But again, if you read Bad Samaritans or Kicking Away the Ladder by Ha-Joon Chang, you'll see that it's actually the imposition of neoliberal policy via the World Bank, the World Trade Organization and the IMF that stifles these countries' economic development. It's actually the proselytizing for the free market which is fucking these countries over and preventing them from developing proper infrastructure.
You're supporting an ideology that ensures billions of people will continue to remain mired in poverty. So go back to your mom's basement, don your Che Guevara t-shirt and genuflect beneath your hammer and sickle flag. But please, don't inflict your colossally retarded hashtag on the rest of us, because you've got no idea what the hell you're talking about.
And that's it. That's the end of his video. And it's just such a mess. He makes this distinction between corporatism and capitalism, which is completely ahistorical and meaningless in the real world. He then asserts that we've got corporatism, not capitalism, and that's the problem, only to then follow up by saying we've got capitalism and that's why everything's so great. He then gives a bunch of examples of societies which have embraced capitalism and supposedly prospered as a result, provided that you interpret the data extremely selectively, but by his own standards, these societies would inarguably be considered corporatist, which he says is the problem. And at no point in his video does he even attempt to give one single clear definition of socialism. There are multiple entirely different things which he calls socialist because he doesn't like them, and yet they're all inconsistent with each other. He said that France is socialist because it had a high tax rate on the wealthy, but then he quotes Churchill, who's clearly not a socialist, but he taxed higher. He says that the welfare state is socialist and that it rewards failure and laziness, but then he says that the welfare state is capitalist and that it's just fine. Later on, he says that Cuba and North Korea, that's what socialism is, but then he says that anti-capitalists support the Swedish model, but they're not anti-capitalists, they're liberals. But of course, if you actually read any of the relevant socialist authors, like Proudhon, Marx, Engels, Bakunin, Kropotkin, etc., you'll see that it has nothing to do with the welfare state. It has nothing to do with taxing and spending, and it has nothing to do with the state undertaking the same functions as the capitalist system. It's about workers' control over the means of production. And this is something which he never addresses in his video, presumably because he has no fucking idea what it means. This video is just an orgy of inconsistent, contradictory arguments and poorly researched drivel. I mean, if he had any sense of intellectual honesty, he would make an apology video correcting the hilarious litany of errors that he's just inflicted upon the unsuspecting masses. But that'll never happen, because here's what makes his video so truly painful to watch. It's the fact that his intense stupidity is juxtaposed with extreme confidence and bravado. It's the fact that each and every baseless, self-refuting assertion is delivered as though it's fucking gospel, and you must be crazy to believe otherwise. Oh, you don't support capitalism? How dare you? You must be fucking colossally retarded. Go back to your mum's basement, etc. The Dunning-Kruger effect posits that the more knowledge you gain, the more aware you become of your own ignorance. Paul Joseph Watson is a classic example of the converse, in which people who know nothing act as if they know everything. This has been Libertarian Socialist Rants with another anarchist commentary. And if any cherished personal belongings have been damaged, don't say I didn't warn you.